August 1945. A gray morning settles over the Allied internment camp in Manila. The air smells of disinfectant and sea salt. Rows of makeshift wooden tables stretch beneath a large canvas tent, buzzing with quiet chatter. Australian nurses, American clerks, and British soldiers sharing a single meal. At the entrance, a group of Japanese women stands frozen. Their khaki uniforms are tattered, faces pale beneath the tropical sun. For years, they were taught that men and women must never share the same table, that modesty defined honor, and separation preserved virtue. Now, before them, a sergeant jokes with a nurse. A woman in uniform laughs openly. Forks clatter against metal trays. No one bows. No one lowers their eyes. The eldest among the Japanese women, a former Red Cross worker, whispers to the interpreter, her voice trembling, "Do they not fear shame?" The interpreter pauses. "No," he replies softly. "Here they call it respect." For the first time, these women see a world untouched by the emperor's order, a world where gender does not dictate silence. The war has ended, but for them, the true shock has only just begun. Before the surrender, before the silence that fell across the burned-out cities, Japan lived within a rigid, sacred order. Every heartbeat of society pulsed in rhythm with the emperor's will. The home, the school, the battlefield, all extensions of one purpose: to serve. In this order, women were not warriors, nor equals. They were the keepers of purity, obedience, and the household spirit. The 1930s and 1940s saw Japan's military rise hand in hand with a philosophy that shaped every citizen. It was called Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother. This ideal demanded devotion without individuality. A woman's strength was measured not by courage, but by silence. By 1941, when Japan plunged into total war, this ideology became weaponized. Young women sewed uniforms, gathered scrap metal, and nursed the wounded in makeshift hospitals. Tens of thousands volunteered for the Women's Volunteer Corps, while others were conscripted to work in munitions factories. Even in propaganda films, they were portrayed as gentle shadows behind the valor of men, smiling, serving, never questioning. But war blurred those lines. As men fell on distant islands, women stepped into roles they were never meant to fill. Nurses treated brutal battlefield wounds in caves from Saipan to Burma. Communications clerks operated military radios in crumbling outposts. Some followed troops into occupied territories, not as soldiers, but as functionaries, caretakers, or victims of circumstance. Still, they were bound by one unbreakable law: men and women must never mix beyond duty. Meals, quarters, and even eye contact were governed by the code of modesty. A woman's voice in the presence of men had to remain soft, almost unseen. To laugh aloud beside a man, especially one not of her family, was a breach of dignity. This invisible wall followed them everywhere. In military hospitals, male doctors ate separately from female nurses. In Army headquarters, male officers held meetings in rooms the women could enter, only to deliver tea, bow, and leave in silence. By 1944, as the war turned grim, this division deepened into ritual. Women were expected to embody endurance, gaman, the quiet acceptance of hardship. They slept on straw mats, rationed rice, and wrote farewell letters to brothers who would never return. Their patriotism was measured in restraint. Even when American bombs scorched Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya into ash, many Japanese women believed their suffering was sacred, proof of loyalty. Propaganda reminded them daily that to serve the emperor was an eternal honor, and that shame came not from pain, but from weakness. That belief would soon shatter. In the final months of 1945, as Japan's armies collapsed across the Pacific, many women found themselves far from home, stationed in China, Korea, the Philippines, or the Dutch East Indies. When the surrender was announced on August 15th, they heard the emperor's voice for the first time, not as a divine echo, but as a man's trembling speech over the radio. The empire's illusion broke in a single morning. The women who had lived for its glory now stood in foreign lands, surrounded by enemies who were no longer enemies, and uncertain of who they themselves were. Thousands were taken into Allied custody, not as criminals, but as displaced civilians, nurses, and clerical staff. They expected punishment. They expected humiliation. Instead, what awaited them was something they had never imagined: equality. They did not yet know that in the coming weeks, even the simple act of sharing a table would rewrite everything they had ever been taught. The end came not with a final battle, but with silence. August 15, 1945, the Emperor's voice, broadcast across a defeated nation, drifted through static and disbelief. "Endure the unendurable," he said. For millions of Japanese, those words ended not only a war, but an entire worldview. Across the vast territories once marked by the rising sun, Japanese civilians, men, women, and children, found themselves stranded. In China, in Burma, in the Philippines, in the jungles of Borneo, entire administrative staffs and medical units were suddenly leaderless, directionless. Their empire had dissolved overnight. For many Japanese women abroad, the experience of surrender was bewildering. They had lived under strict discipline, trained to serve male officers and maintain dignity even in ruin. But now the symbols of authority, the flags, the orders, the uniforms, meant nothing. Allied forces, whom propaganda had painted as monsters, entered their camps not with cruelty, but with organized calm. In Manila, the Allied command established temporary holding and repatriation centers for surrendered personnel. Japanese soldiers, nurses, secretaries, and civilians. Among them were groups of women who had served in medical units or clerical posts under the Imperial Army. Their lives had been governed by hierarchy, the male officer's word was law, and social distance was sacred. The Allied camps overturned that order instantly. Here, men and women, even strangers, shared the same space without fear or impropriety. Australian and American nurses dined beside male soldiers. British officers joked with civilian staff. There were rules, of course, but they were born of practicality, not propriety. To the Japanese women, these scenes were surreal. They had grown up in a society where women walked 3 paces behind men, where conversation between genders was formal, cautious, and brief. In Japanese barracks, the female nurses bowed when entering a room of men. Now they saw women saluting men as equals, laughing, debating, commanding. The psychological impact was immense. Some felt shame, others awe, and a few an unspoken envy. The war had stripped them of their homeland, but what they saw in Allied behavior hinted at something alien, a freedom not defined by duty. Back in Japan, a similar transformation was beginning under General Douglas MacArthur and the Allied occupation. The Emperor renounced his divinity. The Imperial Army was dissolved. New laws redefined the nation's identity. Women, once invisible in politics, gained the right to vote in 1946. Schools began teaching democracy instead of devotion. But for those still abroad, the nurses and clerks awaiting repatriation, these changes came not through newspapers, but through lived encounters. Every shared meal, every conversation with an Allied nurse or Red Cross officer carried the quiet realization that the world outside Japan was different, and perhaps better. One account from a former Japanese nurse describes this moment vividly. "They invited us to eat together, men and women, all sitting at the same table. I could not lift my eyes. I thought it was improper. But they smiled, no one was ashamed. I remember thinking, how free they looked." The Allied camps became schools of unintentional enlightenment. Hygiene, nutrition, equality, and open discussion replaced hierarchy, secrecy, and silent endurance. For many Japanese women, this was the first glimpse of gender balance and mutual respect, not as theory, but as daily life. By early 1946, repatriation ships carried thousands back to Japan. The women who disembarked at Yokohama, Hiroshima, and Sasebo were not the same as those who had left years earlier. They carried new eyes and new questions. How had the world moved so far ahead while Japan remained locked in obedience? Why had they believed in separation as virtue? And what would become of a nation built on silence, now forced to listen? These questions would echo through the ruins of post-war Japan, questions that would soon shape its rebirth. On the surface, the surrender of Japan was a geopolitical event, a military decision sealed by documents and signatures. But for those who lived it, the moment was far more intimate, fragile, and human. Among the most affected were the women, nurses, clerks, teachers, and civilians scattered across Asia's collapsing front lines. They had been raised to see themselves as the silent backbone of an invincible empire. Now they were powerless witnesses to its fall. In the Philippine internment camps, former military nurses like Sachiko Tanaka and Chiyoko Nishida wrote of the confusion and humiliation of captivity. These women had served in field hospitals where supply shortages meant treating hundreds of wounded soldiers with a handful of bandages. They had watched the war end in agony, not triumph. When Allied soldiers entered their camps, they expected punishment or violation, the dark images their own propaganda had painted for years. But instead, they saw order, discipline, even kindness. Australian medics brought food. American nurses distributed soap and medicine. No one barked orders. No one struck them. For the first time, these Japanese women were treated not as servants but as human beings. To many, this was a deeper shock than defeat itself. The enemy, whom they had been told was barbaric, acted with compassion and professionalism. Meanwhile, the discipline of the imperial system that had ruled them for decades lay broken, exposed for its cruelty and illusion. One Japanese doctor later recalled, "We thought the Americans would hate us. Instead, they gave us food. That moment changed my life." Even the smallest gestures took on symbolic weight. A female Allied officer holding a cigarette, speaking openly to a male lieutenant. A woman giving instructions to soldiers without fear. A shared laugh between ranks. These moments, simple to Western eyes, were revolutionary to the women of Japan's wartime generation, yet the emotional transformation was not immediate. For weeks, shame lingered. Many refused to sit at mixed tables or look male officers in the eye. Some wept privately, torn between loyalty to their upbringing and the undeniable evidence of another way to live. The Allied forces, unaware of the cultural depth of this shock, continued their daily routines. They saw no scandal in equality. To them it was simply normal. But for Japanese women, trained to equate modesty with worth, the sight of equality was both liberating and terrifying. This was the human battlefield of post-war awakening, a confrontation not of armies, but of values. As the days passed, curiosity replaced fear. Japanese nurses began asking Allied women about their lives, about education, family, and service. They learned that many had volunteered for war duty, not because they were ordered, but because they chose to. They learned that these women voted in elections, studied medicine, and even commanded military units. The idea of choice itself was foreign. In pre-war Japan, duty was inherited, not chosen. To live otherwise was rebellion. Through quiet conversations over rations and tea, these prisoners began to realize that the defeat of their nation might also be the opening of their minds. Not all accepted it. Some clung to the old codes, unable to reconcile their faith in the emperor with this new reality. Others, especially the younger ones, listened, absorbed, and carried those memories home. When they returned to Japan months later, they brought with them invisible seeds of change. These were the women who in the 1950s would become teachers, nurses, and advocates for education. Their exposure to Western equality, even briefly, had altered their sense of what was possible. For the Allies, it was a routine occupation. For the Japanese women, it was a quiet revolution, one that began not with speeches or laws, but with a shared meal, that single moment, when men and women sat side by side without shame, became a living metaphor for everything Japan would struggle with in the years to come. The human heart had begun to question obedience. And in that questioning, a new Japan was slowly being born. To understand the full weight of that shock, the moment Japanese women saw men and women eating together, one must see it not as a scene of curiosity, but as the collision of two civilizations. For centuries, Japanese culture had drawn its moral architecture from Confucian and feudal values. Hierarchy defined all human relationships: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife. Each knew their place. Each acted within invisible boundaries. Harmony was achieved not through freedom, but through obedience. The Allied world, by contrast, was built on the Enlightenment ideal: liberty, individuality, equality before law. By 1945, these ideals had matured into social norms. Women in Britain, the United States, and Australia worked as code breakers, pilots, engineers, and nurses. They could vote, argue, and speak their minds. The war had accelerated their emancipation. So when these two worlds met in the ruins of Asia, it was more than a military encounter. It was a moral confrontation, between duty and choice, between silence and voice. For the Japanese women prisoners, the Allied camp was not merely a place of captivity. It was a living classroom of Western ethics. They saw that authority could coexist with empathy, that a woman could wear a uniform, issue orders, and still be respected. That discipline did not require fear. In the Japanese system, fear had long been the glue that held order together. From childhood, citizens were trained to suppress individual desire for the collective good, wa or harmony. Emotional restraint was patriotism. To question was to endanger unity. In contrast, the Allied ethos prized initiative. Soldiers were encouraged to think independently, to challenge, to innovate. For the first time, these women saw that disagreement was not disloyalty, it was dialogue. The moral weight of that realization was immense. In the quiet of the camp, they began to unlearn what the Empire had taught them. One Allied nurse later recalled a conversation with a young Japanese interpreter. She asked me why we laugh with men. I told her because we can. She looked confused, as if laughter itself was a foreign concept. It was not arrogance, it was wonder. The Japanese women were not ignorant. They were conditioned. Their entire moral compass had been calibrated to a world where men embodied decision and women embodied sacrifice. Now they were confronted with a world where dignity came from self-expression, not suppression. This encounter exposed the moral fractures within Japan's wartime ideology. The empire had demanded absolute purity and loyalty, even as its policies had sent millions to die in futile defense. The women now understood that their virtue had been weaponized, used to sustain a system that had ultimately betrayed them. There was also a spiritual dimension to this confrontation. The Japanese concept of on, debt of gratitude, had shaped social behavior for centuries. Every act of kindness required repayment, every favor a lifetime of obligation. The Allied worldview, grounded in Christian and humanist ethics, viewed compassion as universal, a duty not of repayment, but of conscience. When Allied soldiers shared food with their captives, they expected nothing in return. To the Japanese women, this was bewildering. It was mercy without debt, generosity without hierarchy, and within that mercy lay the seeds of transformation. In the coming years, these lessons would echo through post-war Japan's reconstruction. The occupation government, influenced by these same Western ideals, would rewrite the Japanese constitution, enshrining equality between the sexes. Women gained suffrage, education reforms reshaped schools, and new cultural spaces opened for dialogue. Yet the transformation was not immediate, nor painless. Many of the women who had seen this other world firsthand returned to homes still bound by old customs. Their stories were often silenced, their experiences buried under shame or denial, but within them burned a quiet certainty. The knowledge that another way of life was possible, the act of eating together, once unthinkable, had become the symbol of a new moral order. It was the simplest of gestures, yet it revealed everything the empire had denied: equality, respect, humanity. And as these women carried that image home, Japan's cultural evolution had already begun, not through policy but through perception. December 1945. The tropical rain fell steadily over Manila Bay as the first Japanese repatriation ships prepared to sail. Thousands of former soldiers, nurses, clerks, and civilians lined the docks, silent, thin, and hollow-eyed. Behind them, the war was over. Ahead of them, home was a mystery. Among them stood a group of women, mostly in faded khaki uniforms, some barefoot, carrying cloth bundles instead of luggage. For months, they had lived in the Allied processing camps where the routines were calm but strange: shared duties, shared meals, shared humanity. Now, as they waited to board, they faced the final crossing, not just of the sea but of identity. Inside the camp, the last morning meal was being served. Long tables beneath canvas roofs, rows of tin plates, the smell of boiled potatoes and coffee. Allied soldiers and Japanese internees sat side by side. No ranks, no barriers, a quiet rhythm of spoons against metal trays. A few of the Japanese women hesitated at the entrance, as they had on that first day. But this time they walked forward. They took their seats among strangers, men and women alike. The memory of shock was still there, but now it was softened by understanding. For months they had watched the Allies live as equals. They had seen female officers stand beside male counterparts and give orders without shame. They had seen men open doors for women, not because they were superior, but because they were polite. Now in this final breakfast, the symbol of that world sat before them, a simple, shared table. Across from one Japanese nurse sat an Australian lieutenant, his arm in a sling. He offered her bread. She bowed slightly, took it, and for the first time smiled without fear. No interpreter was needed. No words could have explained the enormity of that gesture. This was the true climax, and not of battle but of realization. The moment the ideology of separation crumbled in the quiet simplicity of coexistence. For the Allied officers it was routine. For the Japanese women it was revelation. When the call to board came, they filed silently toward the pier. The ships, mostly former military transports, bore new markings now. White hulls with black letters, repatriation vessel. The American guards saluted as the women passed. Some bowed deeply in return. From the deck the city receded, Manila's ruins glowing in the tropical light. The women gathered along the railing, gazing at the horizon. For many it was the first time they had seen the sea without fear of bombers or invasion. But what weighed heavier than memory was the question of what awaited them at home. The Japan they had left years ago no longer existed. The emperor had renounced his divinity. The military had been disbanded. Rumors spread that women could vote, that American officers walked freely through Tokyo streets, and that even the most sacred traditions were being rewritten. For women like Sachiko and Chiyoko, this was unimaginable. The world they had just glimpsed in Allied camps, where gender was not a prison, might now be unfolding in their homeland. Below deck, the ship's engine throbbed through the steel hull. The women sat in the dim light, their belongings tied neatly at their feet. Some whispered prayers to the ancestors, asking forgiveness for survival. Others stared silently, holding their rations, American chocolate bars, Red Cross biscuits, symbols of a kindness they could not yet name. Outside, the sea was calm. The war that had consumed Asia for nearly a decade had ended. Yet within these women, a new kind of war had begun, the struggle between memory and change. At dusk, an Allied nurse stood on the dock, watching the ships fade into the mist. She later wrote in her journal, "They came to us broken and they leave changed." They saw that freedom does not shame women. It completes them. That line would never reach the newspapers, but it captured the essence of what had occurred, a quiet revolution carried by those who had once been its most obedient victims. For the Japanese women aboard those ships, the ocean crossing was not merely a return home. It was the passage between two worlds, one of submission, one of awakening. And as the last light of the Pacific disappeared, they understood, even if faintly, that defeat had brought something their victory never could: the chance to see humanity without walls. When the repatriation ships reached Japan, dawn broke over a nation barely recognizable. The ports were crowded with ruins and refugees. Smoke still rose from flattened cities. The land that had once declared itself divine now smelled of ash and hunger. The women disembarked slowly, stepping onto soil that felt both familiar and foreign. Some knelt, pressing their hands to the ground in tears. Others looked around in disbelief. There were no banners, no marching bands, no officers waiting to salute. Only the hum of American trucks and the soft murmur of civilians scavenging among debris. For the returning women, it was not victory, but revelation. The Japan they had left behind had been an empire of certainty, where loyalty defined identity and obedience was virtue. The Japan they returned to was a broken experiment, ruled not by generals but by reformers and occupation officers. Within weeks, they began to see it, the new order emerging from the ruins. Women walking beside men in the streets of Tokyo, Allied nurses sharing food with Japanese children, American military newspapers carrying headlines about democratic reconstruction. At first, the shock mirrored what they had experienced in the camps. But now, it struck deeper. This was not the foreign world of the victors. This was home. The imperial woman ideal, once sacred, began to crumble from within. The rituals of deference, the silence, the unquestioning submission, all seemed hollow now. They had seen another way to live, one that did not depend on hierarchy or fear. Some tried to return to old routines. They bowed, avoided eye contact, spoke softly, but the world around them refused to bend back. Allied reforms encouraged women to work, to vote, to study. Radio broadcasts spoke of freedom and equality, words that had once been whispers of treason. The government schools began teaching a new constitution, one that declared, all people are equal under the law. Article 24 of that document, revolutionary in its simplicity, stated that marriage must be based on mutual consent, and that men and women were equal partners in society. For women who had once believed modesty was a duty to the emperor, this was a philosophical earthquake. Some wept in gratitude. Others recoiled, unsure what to believe. How can a woman be equal? One former nurse asked in an interview decades later. All my life they told us our value was obedience. But when I saw the foreign women laugh beside men, I realized maybe they were not disobedient. Maybe they were free. The emotional rupture was profound. Many carried guilt. Guilt for surviving when others had died. Guilt for losing faith in the ideals they had served. Some felt torn between two identities: the loyal daughter of the empire and the emerging woman of democracy. The Allied occupation authorities, meanwhile, viewed these women as symbols of Japan's transformation. They were encouraged to become teachers, nurses, administrators, roles that would help spread democratic values. Yet the transition was uneven. In villages and small towns, tradition clung like ash to the ruins. The idea of women working beside men or sharing meals in public remained scandalous to many elders. But the seeds had been planted. The women who had tasted equality, even briefly, could not unsee it. The simple image of a shared table had become a silent rebellion. Each time they sat beside a man without bowing, each time they spoke their minds without shame, they defied centuries of inherited obedience. What began in Allied camps as confusion had evolved into conviction. The women who had once asked, "Do they not fear shame?" now understood that true dignity came not from silence but from respect. The collapse of the imperial woman ideal was not loud or violent. It unfolded quietly, in kitchens, in classrooms, in conversations between mothers and daughters. It was a revolution without slogans, carried in the memories of those who had seen another world. By 1947, Japan had formally adopted its new constitution. The nation's transformation was legal, political, and social, but beneath it all, it was deeply human. The women who had once stood frozen at the sight of men and women eating together were now part of the society that would redefine what it meant to be Japanese. Defeat had stripped away the empire's illusions. But in that emptiness, something remarkable had emerged, a moral rebirth, born not from conquest, but from understanding. When the repatriation ships unloaded their passengers, Japan was not merely defeated, it was hollow. The cities were skeletons of steel and soot, the countryside stripped of sons, fathers, and grain. Nearly 7 million Japanese were returning from abroad, soldiers, colonists, and civilians who had served in every corner of the fallen empire. Among them were tens of thousands of women who had seen a world their homeland could scarcely imagine. For many, homecoming meant silence. The neighbors stared. The relatives whispered. To survive surrender was already shameful. To have lived among the enemy unguarded, even more so. Some women concealed where they had been. They said nothing of the Allied camps, of the meals, or of the kindness they had received. In the deeply wounded psyche of post-war Japan, defeat still carried the weight of moral failure. Yet beneath that silence, something was shifting. The women who had glimpsed equality abroad began to notice the contradictions in their homeland. While the nation preached reconstruction, society still chained women to domestic servitude. Many who had been trained as nurses or clerks were dismissed and told to marry. A woman's place is the home, they were reminded. Words that now sounded archaic, almost absurd after seeing American and Australian women command entire medical units. Still, the hunger for survival blurred everything. Japan's first post-war winters were brutal. Food was scarce. Black markets thrived. Families huddled in burnt-out train stations. And amid that chaos, women carried the heaviest burden, finding rice, nursing the sick, raising children amid rubble. The empire's collapse had erased old boundaries but not old expectations. The shock of equality experienced in the camps had, paradoxically, prepared them for endurance. They had seen order and cooperation beyond hierarchy. They had seen systems that valued efficiency over formality. Slowly, these impressions turned into quiet acts of adaptation. A nurse named Fumiko, once stationed in Manila, found work in a local hospital rebuilt under American supervision. There she worked beside male doctors as an equal. Years later, she would tell her students, "The war taught us destruction. The foreigners taught us humanity." In Tokyo, women's associations began forming, small circles of teachers, widows, and nurses who met to discuss social reform. Some had been exposed to Western organization models during their captivity. They spoke of hygiene, literacy, childcare, and the education of girls. What had begun as survival became the foundation of civic awakening. Politically, Japan's transformation gathered momentum. The 1946 general election, the first in which women could vote, drew nearly 70% female turnout. 39 women were elected to the Diet, a number unimaginable even 2 years earlier. Newspapers printed photographs of women casting ballots, their faces resolute. But for many former prisoners, the emotional transition was more complex. They carried both trauma and enlightenment, the memory of collapse intertwined with the glimpse of possibility. Some became teachers and midwives, spreading the principles of hygiene and equality they had learned under Allied supervision. Others retreated into silence, afraid their experiences would be misread as disloyalty. Japanese culture in the late 1940s teetered between pride and renewal. The emperor remained a figurehead, but the true power now lay in reconstruction, in the factories, the classrooms, and the kitchens. In each of those spaces, women worked, not just as caretakers, but as builders of a new moral order. It was a quiet revolution, one without banners or marches. When men returned from the front, broken and jobless, it was often their wives or sisters who kept the family alive. In that act of endurance, the old boundaries dissolved further. The very virtues that had once defined obedience, patience, sacrifice, resilience, became tools of independence. The Allied reforms could change laws overnight, but it was these women who changed hearts over years. They carried the memory of that first shared meal, that moment when shame turned into respect, as proof that dignity could exist outside hierarchy. By the early 1950s, Japan was no longer the land they had once served in silence. It was becoming something else, something freer, uncertain, but alive. By 1947, Japan was no longer an empire. It was an experiment in democracy under occupation. The ashes of Tokyo glimmered with scaffolding and neon signs. Trains began to move again. Markets reopened. The black and white banners of surrender were replaced by new slogans: reconstruction, reform, renewal. For Japanese women, the post-war years became a paradox. They had lost everything: homes, families, the very ideals that once gave their lives meaning. Yet in that loss, they discovered an opportunity unseen in centuries. The Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, enforced sweeping reforms. The 1947 Constitution declared equality between the sexes. Women could vote, inherit property, and seek divorce. The Ministry of Education rewrote textbooks, purging imperial propaganda and introducing lessons on human rights. For the first time, girls studied the same curriculum as boys. But these reforms were not mere politics. They were the living continuation of that first shock experienced in Allied camps, the revelation that respect could exist without hierarchy. Women who had once been confined to obedience now entered classrooms, offices, and hospitals. In Tokyo, former army nurses worked under American supervisors, introducing modern sanitation and surgical practices. In Osaka, war widows opened small shops, turning survival into independence. In Nagasaki and Hiroshima, female teachers taught peace education to children who had never seen war but lived in its shadow. Many of the women who had returned from abroad quietly became leaders in these new institutions. They carried not ideology but memory, the memory of equality lived, not preached. They had seen women and men share meals, decisions, and laughter as equals. They now brought that spirit into workplaces and homes, and yet the transformation was far from complete. Beneath the surface of reform, deep cultural resistance remained. Older generations, shaped by the Meiji and Taisho eras, struggled to accept that a woman could command authority or decline marriage. Many female employees faced discrimination or dismissal once they married. The idea of freedom was often tolerated, not embraced. Still, the tide of history had turned. By the early 1950s, Japan's economy began to recover, fueled by American aid and the Korean War boom. Factories reopened, industries thrived, and cities pulsed with energy. In the midst of this resurgence, a new social archetype emerged: the working woman. She was no longer the silent shadow of her husband or father. She rode trains, wore uniforms, earned her own salary. Newspapers debated her presence. Some called her the face of progress. Others derided her as unfeminine. But she was here to stay. Culturally, the tension between tradition and modernity became one of Japan's defining post-war struggles. The older generation clung to etiquette, the bow, the soft tone, the separation of genders, while the younger women, many inspired by Western examples, experimented with independence. They read magazines about careers, travel, and education. They began to see themselves not as subjects of the state, but as citizens of the world. The transformation reached even the countryside. In villages rebuilt under the Land Reform Acts, women joined cooperatives and school boards. Some ran for local office. The symbol of their awakening was no longer the sword or the chrysanthemum. It was the pen, the ballot, the open conversation. For many of the repatriated women, these changes felt like the completion of a journey that had begun in shock and disbelief. The image of men and women eating together had once represented everything foreign, everything forbidden. Now in Tokyo cafes and factory canteens, it was ordinary life in those small, quiet details, the shared lunch, the exchange of opinions, the laughter between equals. Japan's moral landscape had been rewritten. The empire had demanded silence. Democracy invited speech, and for the first time, women spoke. By the mid-1950s, the memory of occupation began to fade, replaced by the rhythm of modern life. Japan was rebuilding faster than anyone imagined. Its economy surged, its cities gleamed. Yet beneath the progress lay an invisible foundation built by the resilience of those who had endured humiliation, learned empathy, and embraced change. The war had stripped them of everything but truth. And that truth, learned in the simplest of moments, became the moral seed of Japan's rebirth. In the end, it was not a battlefield that transformed Japan. Not the bomb, nor the generals, nor the treaties. It was a table, a simple wooden table under a canvas roof in a foreign camp, where men and women, once enemies, sat and ate together. Where laughter broke the silence of centuries. Where women raised under obedience looked across and saw something they had never seen before. Equality made ordinary. That moment, quiet, unrecorded, almost invisible, marked the beginning of Japan's true post-war revolution. The women who witnessed it carried that vision home. It took years, even decades, for the meaning to surface, but the seed was there. The empire had fallen, and in its place the idea of humanity began to grow. They learned that honor did not require silence, that respect did not depend on fear, and that dignity could live in dialogue. For them, defeat was not the end. It was illumination. The story of Japan's rebirth is often told through steel and industry, through skyscrapers and technology. But beneath all that progress lay something deeper, the moral awakening of a nation that had finally looked beyond hierarchy and seen itself reflected in the eyes of others. A new generation of Japanese women would grow up unbound by the old codes. They would walk beside men in schools and workplaces in life, not as subordinates but as equals. And though they might never know the origins of that change, it began there in that moment of stunned silence, when the daughters of the empire watched the victors share a meal and realized the world could be kind. History remembers wars through destruction, but sometimes peace begins with something far more fragile, a gesture, a smile, a shared meal. And in that fragile moment, Japan began its long journey, from obedience to understanding, from shame to dignity, from empire to humanity.